Well, you're right. It was a very different kind of Prime Minister's questions from the ones we've been used to recently. It was about political divides, no mention of who drank what where and who lied about what when. There was even a little sort of, not quite intimate moment, but friendly moment when Keir Starmer went up and tapped Liz Truss on the arm at the end of question time and congratulated her in person. Liz Truss was emphasising, under pressure from Keir Starmer, that she wouldn't go near that windfall tax idea that you were just talking about. She's very comfortable in that sort of zone. That plays to her sort of free market politics. But tomorrow, that doesn't detract from the fact that she is about to walk into a sort of a bad fever dream for a free marketeer. She is going to announce in the House of Commons that she is borrowing scores of billions. We think around 150 billion in order to put it into price controls. That really is the sort of stuff that would give a free marketeer cold sweats. But she feels she has absolutely no choice about that, and she's been backed by events into a corner. Everybody looking, of course, this first full day of her premiership for any other signs about what kind of administration this is going to be. The reshuffle has carried on. A few jobs for some of Rishi Sunak's supporters in the lower ranks, the middle ranks of the government, but everybody very much focused, who was a supporter of Rishi Sunak, on the fact that there was only one of his supporters who actually made it into cabinet. You talked then about the Bill of Rights bill being dropped. I wouldn't draw too many conclusions from that in terms of what it tells us about her government, because it was always a very late entry into the last Queen's speech. I was told by people close to the Prime Minister at the time it was to keep Dominic Raab quiet. Other people didn't think it was really going to be much of a bill. It wasn't going to do much good. One other key position today, there aren't many backbenchers who are household names. Steve Baker, the man who has run the ERG pressure group within the Tory parliamentary party, who's been behind so many of the changes on Brexit, on deposing prime ministers, you could argue, that we have seen. He has been put into the Northern Ireland office, and in Brussels and in Dublin they're looking at that. He's the Minister of State below the Secretary of State, but nonetheless it's a very eye-catching name, and it has caught the eyes of people in the EU who are wondering, does this mean that there is really no chance of a compromise at all? Just possibly he's been brought in to make sure that a compromise really does get through, as it were, the hard right of the Tory party. They won't know the answer to that for a while, but right now they're suspecting, from their perspective, it's bad news in terms of compromise. But here's how the first full day of Liz Truss's premiership went, dominated as the months ahead will probably be by that intervention in the energy market.
Liz Truss's new cabinet was summoned to hear about her programme for government, dominated right now by a freeze on energy bills, paid for by something like 100 or 150 billion pounds in borrowing. A protest upped the police presence as Liz Truss faced her first Prime Minister's questions. She arrived to muted cheers from an anxious party. Under her, the Conservatives have stolen some of Labour's approach to the energy bills crisis, but she emphasised the ideology that now divides the two parties.
When she said in her leadership campaign that she was against windfall taxes, did she mean it?
Yeah. Very good. I am against a windfall tax. I believe it is the wrong thing to be putting companies off investing in the United Kingdom.
Is she really telling us that she's going to leave these vast excess profits on the table and make working people foot the bill for decades to come?
The reality is that this country will not be able to tax its way to growth.
She's the fourth Tory Prime Minister in 6 years. The face at the top may change, but the story remains the same. There is nothing new about the Tory fantasy of trickle-down economics.
Well, there's nothing new about a Labour leader who is calling for more tax rises.
That put-down cheered some Tory MPs. Many haven't hidden their fears that Liz Truss wouldn't manage big occasions.
It's the same old, same same old tax and spend.
With Boris Johnson now gone from number 10, Theresa May felt able to ask a supportive question of the Prime Minister.
Can I ask my right honourable friend, why does she think it is that all 3 female Prime Ministers have been Conservative?
It is quite extraordinary, isn't it, that there doesn't seem to be the ability in the Labour Party to find a female leader, or indeed a leader who doesn't come from North London. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the issue is.
As the session closed, Keir Starmer crossed over to congratulate Liz Truss on winning the leadership of her party. Friendly pats on the arm were exchanged. The Labour leader was known to loathe Boris Johnson personally. Earlier, the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, met with city bosses. But any message of reassurance didn't stop the pound sinking to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985. Some investors say it's the energy bill freeze that's helping to drive fears about the pound. And the Bank of England hinted the borrowing needed to fund that freeze would mean an interest rate rise soon. There was a staged conversation between the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor to reassure markets that the new Prime Minister, though she'd heavily criticised bank policy, didn't want to dictate it.
I just want to reaffirm my commitment, our commitment to your independence. As I said, independence does not mean immunity from discussion about what you say. I've had a warning of that.
I've had a morning of that, the bank governor said. Tomorrow, on what'll be only her second full day in the job, Liz Truss will be back at the dispatch box, unveiling a giant intervention in the energy market that could define her premiership, and defending massive state borrowing to fund price controls, a free marketeer's living nightmare.
So, as we've heard there, the pound has fallen to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985. Our economics reporter, Neil MacDonald, is with me. Neil, does this mean the markets are losing confidence in Britain?
Well, there are 2 trends that might worry the government and indeed the rest of us. One is the fate of the pound, the other is the cost of government borrowing. If you take the pound first, you're right, it's fallen today. It's been falling for months. So if you were to go back to the beginning of this year, £1 would buy you $1.35. It's not come up yet, but I can assure you that would be the case. And today...
There we are. Hang on. Let's see. So it started at 1.35.
And today, the £1 would buy you $1.14. So a big fall and fairly consistent. On government borrowing, when the government wants to borrow loads of money from big investors, of course, those investors expect a return, a rate of interest. And that rate of interest has recently been going up, actually, to the highest levels for 10 years. Now, all of this has been going on since before Liz Truss became Prime Minister. There is some concern that she might exacerbate some of these problems by turning to the financial markets at this moment and saying, please lend me £150 billion.
Right, so is there anything the government can do to turn that around?
Well, as Gary was reporting, there's a bit of a charm offensive. The government's message is very much, look, the new policy is to go for economic growth, and if we can deliver that, then we may end up borrowing less money in the future. It is also fair to say that not everything that happens on international markets is about us. So if you look at that chart and you can see pound weakness, you could also argue you're looking at dollar strength. And that's been one of the big stories on financial markets this year. Countries like us, Europe, we depend on energy imports. We import a lot of gas. The United States does not. It's an energy exporter, and that has really helped to underpin its currency this year.
Right, well, the Bank of England was again talking about recession today. Is that now inevitable?
Not necessarily. So today, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, was saying that if there is a recession, we should very much blame it on President Putin. But remember, their gloomy forecasts for next year are all based on the expectation that our energy bills are going to be £3,000, £4,000, £5,000. That might not happen if we get this freeze tomorrow. That could mean lower inflation, a smaller hit to our living standards, and possibly no recession. Just one word of caution. The chief economist of the Bank of England also said that if the economy does better, then inflation might end up being slightly higher. We're not certain how the bank would respond to that, but of course it's possible it would mean higher interest rates.
Neil MacDonald. Well, we can speak now to the Shadow Secretary for Business and Industrial Strategy, Jonathan Reynolds. Well, it's clear what the Liz Truss accusation is. Same old Labour, you just want to raise taxes, you don't get aspiration.
Well, I think that's complete nonsense. I mean, I think there were significant statements from Liz Truss today. She agrees with the Labour position that the last 12 years have been very poor ones for the economy in the UK, and I think she agrees with us that there has to be some intervention to stop wholesale energy prices and household bills for energy hitting the levels that we have seen. But I think you're right to say that there was a lurch to the right from Liz Truss. The prospectus that has been put forward, which is unfunded tax cuts and then what ominously are described as supply-side reforms, so usually government code, Conservative code, for reductions in employment conditions and in environmental protections and consumer protections. Look, the bottom line is that that doesn't work. So we've seen under George Osborne, for instance, those big cuts to corporation tax didn't increase business investment. And I would say there is no prospect of paying for those tax cuts by reducing employment rights. And of course, that was what was explicitly promised would not happen at the time of the 2019 election. And as for the jibe on aspiration, I mean, Keir Starmer is a working class guy who became the Director of Public Prosecutions. A wonderful story. We haven't got enough stories like that in this country, so I'm afraid that is completely wrong.
Right, but just for clarity, so you both parties agree that energy bills need to be frozen. What you disagree is how to pay for it. It looks like the government is going to put this on borrowing, and you're saying you would pay for it with a further windfall tax on energy companies. What is wrong with putting it on the national debt? It's got to, you know, around 100% of GDP, and the sky hasn't fallen down.
Well, I think the first thing to say is the suggestion, as has been trailed, is perhaps that it wouldn't go on to public borrowing, but households would pay it back over a very significant period of time. And I think that is completely wrong given the level of profit we're seeing in gas and oil production with the North Sea. I think it is legitimate to take a relatively modest share of that and use that to fund this package. But if the government does make those choices, and it would be, I think, somewhat ironic if you remember the austerity years and the warnings from the Conservative Party then, that will limit other things the government could do. And I would say you very much need to see greater ambition in this country around net zero, around industrial strategy, the need to leverage in much greater business, private investment. That would limit some of the choices in that area. But most of all, I think it's a question of where governments, where politicians see as the legitimate sources to raise this funding. And
but
we've
there's
been very
another way
clear it
of
would be through a
looking at
windfall
this,
tax.
isn't there? Which is that, during the austerity years, you said the government was wrong and that there was more room for borrowing. Perhaps this Conservative Party has come round to that idea that, we don't need a new round of austerity right now. What we need is some investment, and that it can go on government borrowing, and that the sky won't fall in because we're in a period of high inflation now, apart from anything else.
Well, I don't think that is what they're saying. If you take the statements from the new Chancellor this week, Kwasi Kwarteng, he is saying those unfunded tax cuts can be paid for by these supply-side reforms. Now, I'm afraid that is not a substantial position. That is completely unproven. And I don't yet see the level of ambition when you talk about investment in the economy, in net zero or in opportunities for this country. I don't think that is the same thing as taking the investment that could happen into that and instead using it to meet the energy crisis in terms of bills right now. I think it is right to use a windfall tax to pay a proportion of that, and then to see the government, as we would like to see, do, for instance, a climate investment pledge and make sure we are getting the opportunities, the good jobs, the opportunities of the future from having a greater ambition in net zero. So I'd like to think they've been have converted in their opinions, but I see nothing from the Conservative Party on that.
Just on the politics, I mean, it may be a good thing that Punch and Judy is going out of PMQs in a sort of a Truss Starmer era, but admit it, she was better than you were expecting.
No, from the beginning, Keir Starmer and everyone in the Labour Party has said we will not underestimate Liz Truss. I mean, she's been a part of every government in the last 12 years. She couldn't have moved between those governments without some level of political skill. So, of course, she has that. But fundamentally, what we saw from Liz Truss today, it's not where the British people are at. It's not where businesses are at. It's a lurch to the right. And that is simply not only unpopular, I would say, but not a proven sustainable position for the government of the UK to be in. So I've never underestimated Liz Truss, but I don't think she got herself into a good position today at Prime Minister's Questions.
Jonathan Reynolds, thank you.
Thank you.